Tonight we begin with a military development that NATO officials had feared, Western intelligence had tracked, and Ukrainian commanders had been preparing for in silence. A strategic ambush that unfolded not over weeks, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that exposed critical vulnerabilities in NATO's intelligence apparatus. 72 hours that left Western defense ministers scrambling for answers. 72 hours that forced a complete reassessment of everything the alliance thought it knew about Russian capabilities. What the Kremlin did this week crossed a line that NATO leadership had desperately hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Kyiv did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with fury, and with a level of tactical sophistication that caught even their allies off guard. For months now, there had been signals, not official communiques, not formal diplomatic warnings, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. The Kremlin has been aggressive, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a logic, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian force movements know the indicators, the repositioning of strategic reserves, the unusual communications, blackouts, the sudden rotation of command personnel, the unexpected pause in offensive operations. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western satellites had been tracking Russian military activity along the northern and eastern fronts for weeks. There was movement, that much was clear. The nature of that movement was obscured by an electronic warfare blanket that had not been deployed at this scale since the earliest days of the invasion. NATO signals, intelligence teams, found themselves effectively blind, and that blindness, it turns out, was intentional. Early Tuesday morning, Ukrainian forward reconnaissance units detected what they described as massive logistical preparations, including the forward positioning of ammunition depots and fuel reserves that had not been moved in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only concentrates when they are signaling something very specific. A major offensive push, a strategic feint, or a deliberate provocation designed to draw NATO into direct involvement. Western analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Moscow was changing its operational posture, and when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts its posture without explanation, even by small measures, every defense ministry from London to Tokyo pays attention. What made this situation particularly alarming was the direction of the build-up. This wasn't concentrated along the contested Donbass front lines where fighting has been most intense. This was positioned further north, toward areas that had seen relative quiet for months. The implication was clear. Russia was preparing to open a new axis of attack, one that NATO had assessed as unlikely. That assessment, it turns out, was catastrophically wrong. The warning issued by the Pentagon tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic, it was urgent. Officials, after classified briefings, described Russia's move as destabilizing, calculated, and perhaps most importantly, designed to exploit what Moscow perceived as growing fractures within the Western alliance. But psychological warfare only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most decisive and devastating we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of detecting the Russian buildup, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated counterstrike that targeted not the advancing columns, but the infrastructure that would have sustained them. These weren't the reactive, defensive strikes we've seen in previous months. These were pre-planned surgical operations, strike packages that Ukrainian intelligence had clearly been developing for exactly this scenario. Ukraine only deploys these capabilities when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield, and reshape it they did. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that Ukrainian forces launched precision strikes on 17 high-value targets, including a forward command post that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was coordination of the new offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit ammunition stockpiles. They hit fuel depots positioned to sustain a multi-week advance. They hit communications nodes that were likely preparing to coordinate combined arms operations across a 200-kilometer front. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's planned offensive, the logistics that would have made it sustainable, the command structure that would have made it coherent, the fuel that would have made it mobile. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's build-up wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the strategic landscape if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian infrastructure, they didn't target population centers. They hit military-industrial nodes. They hit the backbone of Russia's offensive capability. Reports indicate that secondary explosions at several of the targeted sites continued for hours after the initial strikes, a clear indication that significant quantities of ammunition and fuel were destroyed. One Western defense official, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the Ukrainian operation as textbook combined arms interdiction and noted that the speed and precision of the response suggested extensive pre-positioning of intelligence assets. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of NATO support for Ukraine after months of political uncertainty in Washington and fractured messaging from European capitals. Moscow wanted to see whether the West would flinch, whether Ukraine would panic, whether the cracks in the alliance would finally widen into gaps. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't flinch. They responded with a counter-offensive so swift, so devastating that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But today Kyiv did. Military analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's shift as probing aggression, a way to test Western resolve without committing to a full-scale escalation. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and committed. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or relocate their assets. That timing matters because it shows the depth of Ukrainian intelligence penetration. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russian moves, they are anticipating them. They are operating inside Russia's decision cycle. And in modern warfare, that advantage is often decisive. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian long-range strike units carried out attacks on logistics hubs in occupied territories, forcing Russian commanders to halt planned troop movements. Ukrainian naval drones targeted a supply vessel in the Black Sea that had been positioned for resupply operations in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian cyber units, operating in coordination with ground forces, reportedly disrupted communications networks used by Russian forces to coordinate artillery strikes. This wasn't just defense, this wasn't just retaliation, this was force projection. This was strategic initiative, and strategic initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed offensive last spring. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their ability to hold it. For every resource Russia commits, Ukraine finds a way to make that commitment costly. And tonight, that cost was measured in destroyed equipment, disrupted plans, and a Kremlin that is now forced to recalculate. Remember, Russia thought this war would be over in 3 days. They thought Kyiv would fall within a week. They thought Western support would fracture by the first winter. They thought Ukraine's military would collapse under sustained pressure. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian-controlled territory than ever before. Western weapon systems are proving more effective than Moscow predicted, and the alliance that Putin hoped to divide is showing, at least for now, renewed coordination. The humiliation NATO faces tonight is real. Their intelligence failure allowed this ambush to develop largely undetected, but the humiliation Russia faces is potentially far more damaging. Their ambush was detected, countered, and neutralized before it could achieve any operational objective. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary domestic and international pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want escalation, pragmatists want negotiation, military commanders want resources, economic advisors want stabilization. Putin is balancing these demands while managing an economy strained by sanctions, a military depleted by casualties, and a population increasingly weary of a war that was supposed to be swift and decisive. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. That vulnerability makes Putin unpredictable, and unpredictability in a conflict involving nuclear-armed powers is the most dangerous variable of all. Western officials are now watching closely for any indication of how the Kremlin will respond to today's setback. The concern is not just what Russia will do militarily, but how Putin will frame this failure domestically. A leader who cannot admit defeat often doubles down, and doubling down in this context could mean escalation options that have so far remained off the table. NATO's emergency statement, now circulated to all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow this provocation to go unanswered. Officials said plainly that Russia's military buildup was inconsistent with stated commitments to de-escalation. That is diplomatic language for "we know exactly what you were planning and we're prepared to respond." You don't usually hear that tone from Brussels unless something serious is at stake. The statement also reaffirmed NATO's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, language that, while familiar, carried additional weight given the context of today's events. Several member states have already indicated willingness to accelerate weapons deliveries in response to Russia's actions. Germany, which has often been cautious in its support, issued a notably sharp condemnation of the Russian buildup, calling it a deliberate attempt to destabilize European security. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, resolute speech tonight. He said, "They thought we would not see them coming. They were wrong." He said, "Every time they test our resolve, we will answer with strength." And he said, "Ukraine does not wait for threats to become attacks. We act, we strike, we defend. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become." Zelensky also addressed Western allies directly, thanking them for intelligence sharing, while pointedly noting that Ukraine's soldiers, not foreign troops, are the ones bleeding for European security. That message was unmistakable. Support is welcome, but Ukraine is carrying the burden of this fight. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the military buildup in the north, Belarus also conducted military exercises near the Ukrainian border, raising concerns about a potential second front coordination. Russian naval activity in the Black Sea increased significantly, with additional vessels positioning for potential strike operations. Russian cyber attacks increased in frequency and sophistication, targeting Ukrainian government systems and critical infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. The coordination suggests this was not an opportunistic probe, but a deliberate strategic operation, one designed to stretch Ukrainian defenses and test Western response mechanisms simultaneously. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a renewed winter offensive, using the current buildup as a positioning phase for larger operations. Another is that Russia is attempting to create leverage for potential negotiations, demonstrating capability while hoping for diplomatic concessions. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke a response that could be framed as NATO aggression, providing justification for further escalation. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for NATO to act. They didn't defer to Western caution. They didn't hesitate in the face of overwhelming force concentration. They struck first, struck hard, and struck with precision that left no doubt about their capabilities. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see whether Western support will outlast Ukrainian casualties. Ukraine wants to show that every Russian advance will come at an unsustainable cost. NATO wants to prevent the conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders, and China wants to assess whether Western resolve is something that can be waited out. Every actor in this drama is watching not just what happens on the battlefield, but how the others respond. Today's events sent signals to all of them. To Russia, your moves will be detected and countered. To NATO, Ukraine remains a capable partner even when your intelligence fails. To the world, this conflict is not approaching resolution, it is approaching a new phase. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian communications for any indication of Moscow's next move. They say Russian commanders are conducting damage assessments at multiple sites hit in today's strikes. They say the Kremlin has convened emergency meetings to discuss the operational setback, and they say Russia's decision to concentrate forces in the north is likely part of a broader winter campaign intended to break Ukrainian morale before spring. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is escalating pressure. Their response today, swift, lethal, and strategically coherent, sent a message to Russia that every provocation will be met with consequences. And it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine is not a passive recipient of Western aid, but an active, capable military power in its own right. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this operation. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian operational planning, it destroyed critical military infrastructure, and it demonstrated that Ukraine retains the ability to take initiative even under pressure. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit that cost them significant resources. If they double down, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to match escalation with escalation. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times before. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon them. And every attempt to break Ukrainian resistance only strengthens it. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear: Russia's ambush failed, Ukraine's response succeeded, and the next chapter of this war will be written by those who refuse to back down, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.